Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into the murky depths of royal disaster, forgotten kings, obscure kingdoms, and the kind of mismanagement that turned fields to famine and castles to rubble. Picture yourself walking barefoot across damp cobblestones, a thin fog curling around your ankles as the smell of smoke and sewage clings to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls for a death that's not yours, yet. But give it time. One poor decision from the throne above could trickle down and end you by sunrise. Because back then, all it took was a king with a grudge, a coin shortage, or just plain stupidity to destroy an entire generation. And the best part? These weren't the Henrys or Richards you've heard about in history class. These were the other guys, the ones who don't get movies made about them because they were too petty, too inept, or too unlucky to survive the spotlight. And you probably wouldn't survive them either. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these sleepy little stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a crumbling wall. Below you, fields gone fallow, a village too silent. You're in Anjou in the year 1131, where a 14-year-old boy has just slipped from a horse, landed awkwardly, and died on the spot. His name, William Adelin. His death, a catastrophe, because he was the only legitimate son of King Henry I of England. And with him gone, the country's fragile peace is about to implode like rotted wood under weight. The ship that carried William the White Ship was supposed to be fast, elite, and safe. But the crew had been drinking. Everyone had. A night crossing from Normandy to England turned into a drunken show of arrogance. The ship struck a submerged rock just outside the harbor and sank in icy black water. William tried to escape in a lifeboat, but turned back to rescue his half-sister. That hesitation cost him his life. Henry, I never recovered. They say when he heard the news, he never smiled again. But his grief wasn't just personal, it was political. With no clear male heir, the English succession was now a giant question mark. And in medieval times, a question mark usually meant war. Henry tried to secure the throne by naming his daughter Matilda as heir. But this was the 12th century, and England wasn't ready for a queen. When Henry died in 1135, Matilda's cousin Stephen of Blois claimed the throne with help from the barons. What followed was 20 years of civil war, the anarchy they called it. Castles burned, roads turned into ambush zones, famine spread, bandits thrived. And somewhere amid the chaos, your imaginary medieval self is just trying to survive the winter with a half-milled loaf of bread and a prayer. This entire spiral began with a king who assumed tomorrow was guaranteed. Henry had ruled effectively, sure, but he built his future on a single child. And in a world of war horses, storms, and poor medical care, that was a dangerous bet. When William died, the line collapsed like dominoes. Matilda and Stephen tugged the crown back and forth like toddlers with a toy, and the people, of course, paid the price. But that's just the start. Now we head east, Holy Roman Empire territory, to the city of Milan, where another king tried to rule with arrogance and ended up watching a city crumble. Meet Frederick Barbarossa. A big name, a red beard, and a vision to control the unruly northern Italian cities. His mistake thinking cities like Milan would bow easily. They didn't. In 1162, after a failed siege and multiple revolts, Barbarossa ordered Milan destroyed. Not defeated, erased. Walls torn down. Homes smashed. The people scattered. His soldiers salted the fields. It was a warning to other cities, rebel, and this is your fate. But fear doesn't breed loyalty, it breeds resistance. And within decades, a powerful alliance called the Lombard League rose from Milan's ashes. By the time Barbarossa realized his error, it was too late. He lost the Battle of Legnano in 1176. The cities he tried to dominate instead forged a path toward autonomy. And what about Milan? It rebuilt. Slowly, painfully. But it returned defiant and bitter. Barbarossa, for all his strength, had miscalculated human stubbornness. He could raise a city but not erase memory, and that memory would outlive his legacy. You'd think monarchs might learn from these things. But no. We leap forward again this time to 1284 to the coast of England. A small town called Dunwich, once one of the richest ports in the kingdom. Keyword once. Today it's mostly underwater, lost to centuries of storms and neglect. But what sealed its fate wasn't the weather, it was royal indifference. King Edward I was too busy conquering Wales and bankrupting the treasury to care about one town's collapsing cliffs. Repeated requests for help shore reinforcement port reconstruction were ignored. Taxed but abandoned. The merchants of Dunwich watched helplessly as the sea claimed their future inch by inch. And with every inch lost, trade collapsed. Families moved inland. Churches crumbled. The sea didn't need swords to destroy a kingdom. It just needed time and a distracted king. All the while you, a lowly townsperson, might be praying in the night that your home survives one more tide. But prayers can't hold back waves, and your king's too far away to hear them anyway. Across these moments, a pattern emerges: pride, blindness, distraction. Kings who thought themselves eternal. Decisions made for ego or laziness. And always, always, it's the peasants, the townsfolk, the anonymous, you who suffer. You're beginning to notice the smell of damp stone and old firewood in your nose now, aren't you? That uneasy stillness before something snaps. A kingdom's fate teetering on one man's mood. Because back then, all it took was a temper or a misplaced trust, and everything around you could rot. You haven't even met Charles the Bad yet, or John of Bohemia, or the king who invited the Black Death straight through the gates. They're coming. Their crowns polished, their decisions disastrous. And if you were alive back then, you probably wouldn't survive them either. Let's keep going. You're in Navar now, a small kingdom nestled between France and Spain, where the name Charles should have been one of honor. But this Charles this Navar was anything but noble. They didn't call him Charles the Bad for nothing. And as you wander through the twisted halls of his court, cloaked in treachery and dripping with paranoia, you begin to understand why his legacy reads more like a list of felonies than achievements. He was clever, yes. Educated. Charming, even. But beneath that polished veneer was a viper. His reign from 1349 to 1387 was a long parade of betrayals, assassinations, and shifting loyalties. If Charles could gain something from turning on you, he would. And he often did. The first hint of disaster came not from outside enemies, but from Charles himself. He laid claim to land in France through his mother-daughter of King Louis X. But France already had a King John II, and he wasn't keen on sharing. So Charles made deals behind closed doors, switching sides in the 100 Years' War more often than a gambler switching dice. England 1 week, France the next. Peace treaty today, poison tomorrow. In 1354, he orchestrated the murder of a powerful French nobleman, Charles de la Cerda, brutally stabbed in the head with daggers left in a field as a warning. The message was clear: Navar may be small, but Charles the Bad played to kill. In response, King John arrested Charles, thinking that would stop the chaos. It didn't. His allies stormed the prison. The king was forced to release him, humiliated, but the real nightmare was yet to come. In 1356, while France bled on the battlefield at Poitiers, Charles continued his political ballet, forming coalitions, breaking them, and plunging France deeper into instability. Cities starved. Fields went untilled. Banditry soared. All while Charles hoarded wealth, plotted new alliances, and sat comfortably on his throne. And then, oh yes, there was his death, fitting for a man of poison. In 1387, Charles was very ill. His doctors, using the most advanced medieval techniques available, which is to say very little, decided he should be wrapped tightly in brandy-soaked cloth to warm his failing body. A servant tasked with sealing the cloth using a candle accidentally ignited the alcohol. Charles the Bad burned to death, alive, screaming. Not even the worst playwright could have scripted such poetic justice. And yet while he ruled you, some peasant farmer or minor noble trapped in Navarre would have lived under a constant cloud of uncertainty. Today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. Food could vanish if one of Charles's raids angered the wrong baron. One false word, one wrong guest at dinner, and your life might end with a whisper and a cup of wine that tastes oddly bitter. It wasn't always the sword that killed. Sometimes it was the silence. But now the wind is changing again. You're standing on a bridge in 14th century Prague, watching the fog roll over the Vltava River. The statues haven't been placed yet. The stones under your feet are slick with dew and old blood. Welcome to the Bohemian court. And meet John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, blind, proud, and a man who charged into battle without sight. John ruled from 1310 to 1346, and in many ways he was what you'd expect from a medieval monarch obsessed with honor, constantly at war, and eager to make his name known beyond his borders. But as his eyesight failed, something darker bloomed in his pride. Refusing to relinquish power or accept the frailty of his body, John continued to lead his armies into battle, even when he couldn't see. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, he insisted on fighting alongside the French against the English. Blind and aging, he had his knights tie his horse to theirs so he could ride into combat. It sounds romantic in that tragic Arthurian way, but it was a suicide mission. John was struck down. His horse was found piled atop others, all tangled in reins and blood. His death was glorified in legend, but in truth, it was another symbol of a king who valued pride over prudence. What was lost in his final blaze of glory, a stable Bohemia. His son Charles IV would later rule wisely, but only after inheriting a fractured realm teetering from its father's ambitions. If you lived in one of Bohemia's smaller villages, you might have had no idea why your taxes rose suddenly, or why mercenaries were patrolling the countryside. But it all traced back to a man who refused to see, literally and politically, that his time was over. Blind pride. In every sense, let's keep moving. North now. Scotland. The year 1290. The air is damp with salt and moss. You're on a wind-battered cliffside when the news reaches you. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, is dead. She was only 7. She was also the heir to the Scottish throne. Margaret's death, yet another royal child lost too soon threw Scotland into chaos. The kingdom had been holding its breath, waiting for her to arrive from Norway to claim her place. But the journey was rough. The cold got to her. She never made it. With no direct heir, Scotland plunged into what historians now call the Great Cause, a political crisis so tangled it made spider webs look organized. 13 claimants to the throne appeared. 13. Each with supporters, enemies, and ambitions. It was King Edward I of England who stepped in, claiming he'd help arbitrate. Help in this case meant control. He picked John Balliol as king, but only because Balliol was weak enough to manipulate. Balliol tried to act independently, of course, but Edward humiliated him, treating him like a puppet. War broke out. William Wallace emerged. Blood soaked the borders, and the road to Scottish independence would stretch for generations, all from a single child's death. And once again, if you lived back then, you wouldn't have had much say. You might have been a crofter in the Highlands tending sheep only to see your eldest son conscripted into a war he didn't understand. Or maybe you'd watch your village torch itself over rival loyalties, and no matter how far you fled, the chaos would catch up. Because when kings and claimants fight, borders are meaningless. And now we approach one of the most quietly disastrous reigns of them all. France. The mid-14th century. You're walking through the court of King John II. John the Good, they called him. But that title didn't age well. John came to the throne in 1350, a time when France was already buckling under pressure from the 100 Years' War. Instead of reforming or strengthening, John spent extravagantly. He loved knights, tournaments, ceremonial bling. He created the Order of the Star, France's answer to the English Order of the Garter, swearing that his knights would never retreat in battle, which sounded noble until they started dying in droves. John was captured by the English in 1356 after the Battle of Poitiers. The French lost again. John was taken to London, held for ransom. But while in captivity, he enjoyed himself. Lavish feasts, courtly company. It was said he lived better in prison than many French lords lived in freedom. He even voluntarily returned to English custody after his son failed to honor the ransom terms. And France was boiling. The country spiraled into peasant revolts, the Jacquerie, in 1358, where starving farmers rose up, torched manor houses, and slaughtered nobles. It was a bloodbath. Order collapsed. All while King John polished his armor and kept up appearances. So if you were a peasant in Picardy or Champagne or Orléans during John's reign, you were stuck. Caught between war taxation and a crown more concerned with vanity than survival. One after another, the kings keep ruining things. Not through grand evil, though sometimes yes, but often through blindness, to suffering, to the weight of their own decisions, to the fact that when kings falter, it's the common folk who break. And you'd be one of them. Probably hungry, definitely cold. And if someone asked why everything had gone so wrong, all you could do was whisper the king. Let's keep going. You're walking now through narrow streets in the heart of Flanders, your feet crunching on broken pottery and splintered wood. It's 1382 and the city of Ghent simmers like a pot on the verge of boiling over. Tensions are thick in the air, laced with the soot of forge fires and the coppery scent of blood dried on cobblestones. You hear murmurs, angry ones, about taxes, about grain, about the Duke. At the center of it all, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, younger son of the French king, and a man whose ambition outpaced his foresight. He wasn't technically a king, but he ruled like one, and his missteps would spark one of the most explosive uprisings in medieval Europe. The revolt of the Maillotins, a working-class revolt so brutal, it left the gutters clogged with bodies, and the heart of Flanders scorched with rage. Philip inherited the Duchy of Burgundy in 1363, married well, and gathered vast wealth. But wealth needs guarding, and war needs funding. When King Charles V of France died, Philip gained enormous influence over the new king, his nephew, Charles VI. He pushed policies, he raised taxes, he crushed dissent. The spark came when Philip tried to force heavy salt taxes on the already struggling cities of Flanders. Salt wasn't just for flavor, it was for survival. Without it, meat spoiled, fish rotted, winter killed. And now the Duke wanted more coin from the poor for the privilege of not dying from spoiled pork. Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres exploded in revolt. Craftsmen took to the streets wielding mallets, maillots, hence the name Maillotins. Nobles fled. Tax collectors were lynched. The people weren't merely angry, they were desperate. Years of royal mismanagement had stacked dry wood in every alley, and Philip had lit the match. You duck into a nearby doorway as riders gallop past their boots dripping with someone else's blood. The city is chaos, and as always, the court doesn't understand. Philip retreats to his estates, shocked that anyone would question the system. The crown dispatches forces. Rebels are executed by the hundreds. Ghent is surrounded and starved into submission. But here's the thing, the revolt didn't fail. Not entirely. It left scars. It warned the aristocracy that the people could still bite. And it proved that one man's greed, just one, could turn a city into a battlefield. And you, perhaps a tanner's apprentice or the widow of a dead stonemason, might have just been trying to keep warm. You didn't start the fire, but you had to live in the smoke. Now follow me westward again, this time into Wales, to the town of Conwy in 1294. The sea smells sharper here, like iron and windburn. The fortress looms above new and proud, built by order of King Edward I of England. He called himself the Hammer of the Scots, but the Welsh knew his cruelty first. Edward had conquered Wales with brutal efficiency, built castles, 8 massive ones in just a few years. He planted English settlers, imposed new taxes, and expected obedience. But in 1294, the Welsh rebelled under Madog ap Llywelyn, a descendant of their last princes. And Conwy, shiny and proud, as it was suddenly found itself under siege. Inside the castle, Edward himself was trapped. For weeks, wind howled through the arrow slits. Supplies dwindled. Welsh archers haunted the surrounding woods, picking off messengers and cutting off escape. And the king, surrounded by stone and pride, realized he'd underestimated the very people he claimed to rule. Edward escaped eventually, but his campaign had consequences. The Welsh rebellion was crushed, yes, but the resentment he sowed never died. His treatment of Wales set a precedent: conquer and forget. And centuries of English-Welsh hostility were born in those cold towers. You might have been one of the men hauling stones for Conwy's walls, thinking you were building something lasting. But castles are only as strong as the peace that surrounds them. And kings who conquer without care often leave ghosts in their wake. From there, cross the sea with me again. Now we're in Ireland, 1315. The fields are wet with spring rain, and the island is restless. English control here is shallow and weak, held together with tired garrisons and hollow titles. Into this mess strides Edward Bruce, brother of Robert the Bruce of Scotland. He sees Ireland as ripe for conquest, and the Irish desperate for anyone but the English crown him High King. It should have been a turning point. It became a tragedy. Edward Bruce's campaign devastated Ireland. Villages burned, crops were stolen, famine followed. He expected the Irish to rally to his cause, but many viewed him not as a liberator, but as another invader. The land suffered terribly. The campaign ended with Bruce's violent death in 1318, hacked to pieces at the Battle of Faughart. The English still ruled, but the land they ruled was broken. Ireland had been a chessboard, and two arrogant kings had flipped it over in a rage. You, if you were there, might have had your home torched by the Scots one day, and your livestock stolen by the English the next. There was no safety, no harvest, just ruin year after year. So many kings seemed to believe they were ordained to rule, but never stopped to ask what it meant to care for the ruled. Edward Bruce, Edward Foix, Philip the Bold. They all shared the same flaw, mistaking dominion for divine right. And the peasants, the cobblers, the herders, they were the ones who picked up the pieces. But wait, we're not done yet. Not even close. Let's turn now to Castile. It's the 1360s, and Peter I, known as Peter the Cruel, is king. He didn't earn that nickname lightly. His reign is marked by executions, betrayals, and constant paranoia. He has his own half-brother Henry of Trastamara hunted across the realm. But Henry survives, gathers support, raises an army, and with help from the French, he marches against Peter. Spain already fragmented splinters further. Cities are divided. Families are split. Blood runs deep into the soil. At the Battle of Montiel in 1369, Peter is finally defeated and murdered, stabbed in a tent by his own half-brother. An ignoble end to a savage reign. But the cruelty didn't end with Peter's death. The conflict ushered in a new dynasty, but also new instability. Whole regions of Castile had been ravaged. Jewish communities once protected under Peter became scapegoats under Henry. Pogroms erupted. Economic collapse followed. All because two brothers couldn't share a throne. If you lived in Toledo or Cordoba or Seville during this time, you might have fled your home more than once, hiding not from enemy armies, but from neighbors who had turned on you overnight. Safety was an illusion, and kingship, just a dangerous inheritance. You see the pattern now, don't you? Over and over, kings bring ruin, not always out of malice, but often out of blindness. Greed, ego, fear. They think they're carving their names into history, but really they're carving scars into the lives of the living, and you, just another set of footprints in the mud, have to walk through the wreckage. Come. There's another disaster waiting, and another crown that tipped a kingdom into fire. Let's keep going. You wake up to the rattle of chains. Not yours yet, but close enough. The year is 1386, and you're in the streets of Krakow, Poland. The air is sharp with frost and uncertainty. The city is tense. Something massive is shifting in the political winds. Lithuania, that pagan stronghold to the northeast, is about to unite with Catholic Poland. And the man behind it, Jogaila of Lithuania, soon to be known as Władysław Gon Jagiełło. At first, it sounds like a miracle. A pagan duke marrying a Polish queen and converting to Christianity, bringing two realms together in what would become one of Europe's largest medieval unions. A king who might finally bring stability to a region plagued by Teutonic Knights' border raids and internal squabbles. You, like many in Krakow, hope this will be the dawn of something new. But power, even wrapped in holy vows and royal marriages, is never clean. Jogaila's coronation was a political chess move, not a love story. He married 12-year-old Queen Jadwiga, who was already on the throne. Their union sparked unrest. Nobles grumbled. Lithuanians resisted conversion. And the Teutonic Knights, sworn crusaders against pagans, suddenly found themselves without a crusade. They declared that the conversion wasn't real, that Jogaila was faking it, and used that as justification to keep raiding, burning, and pillaging Lithuanian villages. The war that followed dragged on for decades. Fields became battlegrounds. Castles shifted hands. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410 was glorious, yes, one of the greatest medieval clashes ever. But by then, you'd have lived through 20 years of war, instability, and shifting borders. And what did all that glory give you? Another tax. Another burned barn. Another winter rationed by candlelight. Jogaila's rule lasted until 1434, and in many ways it brought long-term strength. But that's the thing with long-term success, it rarely spares the short-term suffering. For decades, villages in Ruthenia and Samogitia bore the brunt of every diplomatic failure. And if you were a peasant in those lands, you might have spent your life wondering why you were freezing in a field while men in fur robes signed papers and toasted to peace. We move south now. The Byzantine Empire, once the jewel of Christendom, now fraying like a rope on the verge of snapping. It's the early 1300s, and you're a merchant in Constantinople. But business is slow, the city's half deserted, and a storm brews not in the sky, but in the palace. The emperor is Andronikos II, Palaiologos. His reign from 1282 to 1328 was a slow-motion tragedy. He cut military spending to save coin, dismissed the navy, raised taxes. But the Ottoman Turks, newly rising across the Bosphorus, were watching and waiting. With no ships to defend the coastlines, no funds to pay soldiers, and no allies left to trust, the empire became a rotting fruit on the vine. Andronikos had a grandson also named Andronikos, who wasn't content to wait for his inheritance. In 1321, civil war broke out, grandfather versus grandson. The empire devoured itself while the Ottomans advanced like termites in the dark. The young Andronikos won eventually, but by the time he took the throne, the damage was done. You, as a citizen of Constantinople, might have been reduced to grinding stale grain in a mortar, while your neighbors fled to monasteries for safety. Ships once filled with silk and spices now carried refugees. The city once known as the center of the world was now a trembling relic. Andronikos II wasn't evil. He just didn't know how to rule. He thought saving money was safer than saving his navy. He thought time was on his side. It wasn't. And when you stood on the sea wall at dusk and looked out toward Anatolia, you could see the fires already glowing in the distance. The Ottomans were coming, but we haven't even reached the worst of it. Back west in England, the Black Death has just ravaged the countryside. Half the population is gone. Entire towns are abandoned. Labor is scarce, food prices rise, and the serfs, suddenly more valuable than ever, begin to ask dangerous questions. Enter King Richard II, a boy king crowned in 1377 at the age of 10. He inherited a broken kingdom, and for a brief moment there was hope. Hope that new blood might bring change. But Richard grew arrogant, detached, surrounded himself with flatterers and cronies, ignored the suffering of the peasants who were now being forced back into their pre-plague place in the social order. In 1381, that tension snapped. The peasants' revolt erupted across the southeast. Led by men like Wat Tyler and driven by rage over poll taxes and unfair laws, thousands marched on London. They stormed the Tower, killed royal officials, demanded freedom, justice, a voice. Richard, just 14, met them, promised them reforms. Then, after Tyler was killed, perhaps murdered, he revoked every promise. Revenge was swift. Rebels were hunted down, executed, their villages punished. You might have been a baker's son in Essex cheering when the king said, "You shall have your freedom only to watch your uncle hanged 3 weeks later." The message was clear: the king giveth and the king taketh away. Richard's reign didn't recover. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile, raised an army, and deposed him. Richard died mysteriously in captivity, likely starved to death. And the kingdom left bruised, paranoid, and ripe for more bloodshed. By now, you're probably wondering, how did so many kings get it so wrong? But the truth is, they rarely saw it as wrong. They thought they were defending order, or God's will, or their own fragile egos. They never smelled the rot under the banquet table, never heard the coughs of the sick outside their castle gates, never noticed the old woman selling her only blanket for a bowl of soup. You would have noticed, though. You'd have lived in it. And now we head north again, to Denmark, to the year 1286. A dark alley in Viborg, a knife, a king murdered. His name was Erik Vive, known as Erik Clipping. His death set off a spiral of royal vengeance and noble resentment. Denmark fractured. Succession disputes rose. And for years, the kingdom bled slowly under weak regents and angry barons. The wound festered. Danish kings were no longer secure. They were watched, constrained, questioned. The nobility grew stronger while the crown grew weaker. And when the Kalmar Union was formed in 1397, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one monarch, it seemed like stability had returned. But only on paper. The union would be plagued by rebellion, betrayal, and backstabbing for the next century. Sweden would eventually leave. Norway would languish. Denmark, always at the center, would be pulled in every direction, north, south, and down. If you lived in one of those kingdoms during the Union, you might never even know which monarch ruled you that year. The names changed. The flags shifted. The taxes remained. In the stories you've been told, kings are strong. They build castles. They win battles. They wear crowns like halos. But in the stories, no one tells kings are tired. They guess. They gamble. They fail. And when they do, it's not the throne that suffers first, it's you. Let's keep going. You're in Avignon now. The year is 1348, and the air tastes of incense rot and quiet dread. This isn't Rome, this is the other papal seat. Because for much of the 14th century, the Pope, the so-called Vicar of Christ, wasn't ruling from the eternal city at all. He was here in southern France under the shadow of French kings, tucked into a palace of luxury while Europe bled. This era, known as the Avignon Papacy, was supposed to bring reform and stability to the Church. Instead, it became a scandalous symbol of royal manipulation and spiritual decay. At the center of this mess was Pope Clement VI, installed with heavy influence from the French crown. He was lavish, politically entangled, and disastrously slow to react when the plague came knocking. You're watching as monks collapse in the street. Bells toll endlessly. Entire neighborhoods fall silent. And the one place people hoped would have answers, the Church gives them incense, vague prayers, and silence. But the real disaster wasn't just the plague, it was what came after. When Clement VI died and Pope Gregory XI finally returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, the damage was done. The move sparked conflict. When Gregory died, a new pope was elected in Rome, but the French cardinals rejected him and elected a second pope in Avignon. Two popes, two infallible men claiming to be the sole voice of God. The Great Schism had begun. And what happens when you live in a village caught between them? Do you obey the Pope in Avignon supported by your local lord, or the one in Rome backed by merchants? What if your priest picks the wrong side? Does his mass still count? You might think this is just theological noise, but in medieval Europe, salvation was everything. If you were a farmer in Provence or a stonemason in Florence, you might genuinely fear for your soul. What if your baby's baptism was invalid? What if your dying confession didn't reach the real church? Suddenly, damnation feels closer than the next harvest. The church was supposed to be the one unshakable pillar of medieval life. And yet the kings of France, greedy, ambitious, short-sighted, turned it into a pawn. By dragging the papacy into political games, they shattered the illusion of spiritual authority. And from that crack, centuries of doubt and rebellion would grow. Now come with me into Hungary. It's the 1390s, and you're traveling the Danube under gray skies, drifting past fortresses that look strong but are full of cracks. Hungary should be thriving. It has land, gold, salt, access to trade. But the kingdom is caught in a mess of succession crises and bad leadership. Enter King Sigismund of Luxembourg. Sigismund is King of Hungary, later King of Germany, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor. But don't let the titles fool you. He spent decades fumbling through conflicts he never quite resolved. In Hungary, he married the Queen Mary of Anjou and claimed the throne. But his rule sparked an uprising. He was kidnapped, then released, then nearly overthrown again. At one point, his political opponents literally walled up a regent alive behind brick. Eventually, he got the upper hand, but the damage lingered. Hungary's nobles grew stronger. Ottoman raids increased. Whole regions operated like independent war zones. And by the time Sigismund moved his attention westward to imperial politics, to Rome, to the Council of Constance, his eastern kingdom was already fraying. You might have been a woodcutter near the Serbian border, watching as bands of mercenaries torched your village one year, then returned for your livestock the next. And when you looked to the crown for protection, you'd find Sigismund off mediating between French theologians and Italian bishops. The empire was crumbling. slowly but surely. Now to the north, Novgorod, Russia. The year is 1471 and the Republic is dying. You're wrapped in furs, watching the great trading city slip away beneath the weight of ambition and conquest. Novgorod was once a model of semi-democratic rule. In a world of monarchs, its Veche, or assembly, let nobles and merchants vote on major decisions. But Ivan III of Moscow, the Grand Prince, wasn't interested in republics. He wanted consolidation. Under Ivan, Moscow grew aggressive. He claimed divine favor, national unity, and the legacy of old Rus. Novgorod, caught between growing Orthodox power and its Catholic-leaning aristocracy, became a threat. So Ivan crushed it. In 1471, he invaded, defeated its forces, and imposed his will. The Veche bell symbol of Novgorod's independence was taken to Moscow, a silent trophy. You, a leather trader or furrier, might have watched the soldiers pass and wondered if the world was ending. By the time it was over, the Republic was a memory. Russia would not have two centers of power, just one. Ruled by tsars, iron-handed, unquestioned. All over Europe, the kings and would-be kings were centralizing, building bigger courts, tighter controls, stronger armies. But the stronger the grip, the more brittle the realm. Every town conquered came with a cost. Traditions lost, institutions shattered, autonomy erased. And what about the Mediterranean you walk now along the crowded streets of Palermo, Sicily? The year is 1282, and the bells of Vespers have just rung. Suddenly screams, blades, chaos. This is the Sicilian Vespers, a massive uprising against the French Angevin rulers who had taken over the island. King Charles I of Anjou had ruled with an iron fist. Heavy taxation, cultural arrogance, French governors imposing laws on Sicilian traditions. The people snapped. On Easter Monday, they turned on the French with terrifying violence. Thousands were killed. It was ethnic cleansing rebellion and political upheaval all in one. The revolt led to the War of the Sicilian Vespers, a conflict that dragged on for decades. Sicily was plunged into instability. Competing claims to the throne, outside invasions, and constant warfare defined the next generation. And all of it, every fire, every corpse, every ruined vineyard, traced back to a king who thought the island was his to dominate. You might have been a shepherd's son near Messina, whose father had his tongue cut out for speaking against a French official. You wouldn't remember the policy that caused it, just the silence that followed. So many of these kings thought they could own what they ruled, that Sicily would become France, that Novgorod would quietly bow to Moscow, that Hungary could survive divided, that the church could serve two masters, that war could solve peace. And every time they were wrong. The people suffered in the margins of their decisions, scraped, starved, pressed into conscription, or erased entirely from the record. No statue would be built for you, but your life bore the weight of their crowns. Now come further east. One last glimpse for tonight. You're in Tamerlane's path. And even kings trembled when he arrived. Let's keep going. You wake beneath a pale dawn sky, ash swirling in the air like snowflakes. The year is 1402, and you're near Ankara in the heart of Anatolia. The ground is scorched. Broken swords lie half buried in the dust. Crows wheel silently overhead. You're walking through the aftermath of the Battle of Ankara, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Ottoman history, and the undoing of a rising empire, all because of a king who underestimated his enemy. That king was Sultan Bayezid Vespers, proud, ruthless, fast to conquer, and faster to offend. They called him Yildirim the Thunderbolt. He'd swept across the Balkans, crushed Serbian princes, and even laid siege to Constantinople. He was poised to turn the Ottomans into the new superpower of the medieval world. But Bayezid made one critical mistake. He challenged Tamerlane. Tamerlane Timur wasn't a king in the European sense. He was a warlord, a destroyer, a storm on horseback. By the time he arrived on the eastern edge of Bayezid's territory, he'd already turned entire cities in Persia to ash. His empire stretched across Central Asia, and his armies moved with terrifying speed. But Bayezid didn't flinch. He believed in his own myth. The two met in the summer of 1402. Bayezid brought his janissaries. Timur brought elephants. Yes, elephants armored and furious, trampling cavalry like blades of grass. The Ottomans were crushed. Bayezid was captured, trapped in a cage, and paraded like a trophy until his death a year later. And the empire, it shattered. With Bayezid gone, his sons turned on each other in what became known as the Ottoman Interregnum, a civil war that lasted over a decade. Anatolia fractured into rival fiefdoms. Balkan lords rebelled. Constantinople, which had almost fallen, now breathed freely again for another half-century. And you might have been a spice merchant in Bursa watching your trade routes disappear overnight. Or a soldier's widow in Edirne waiting for a son who never came back. The thunderbolt had promised glory, but glory when broken leaves nothing but embers. Tamerlane himself wasn't building anything lasting. His empire would dissolve quickly after his death. But in that moment, he revealed how fragile even the strongest kingdom could be. All it took was one storm. Now come west with me again, to the Kingdom of Naples. It's 13 6 Queen Joanna. Has just been strangled in her own castle. She was controversial, yes. Her reign was long and unstable. She married multiple times, some say too many, and made political enemies everywhere. But she also tried to rule in a world not built for her, and it cost her everything. Her cousin Charles of Durazzo claimed the throne by force. He invaded Naples, seized power, and had Joanna murdered, smothered with a pillow, while imprisoned in her summer palace. No trial, no mercy, just politics. Charles became Charles III of Naples, but his reign was cursed from the start. The people resented his coup. The papacy wavered in support. And within 5 years, he was assassinated by agents of Louis of Anjou, yet another claimant to the Neapolitan crown. For decades, Naples would be a chessboard. Different factions claiming kingship, cities flipping allegiance, and ordinary people trapped in the crossfire. The countryside was pillaged again and again. Bands of mercenaries no longer paid simply turned to looting. And the cities Naples, Bari, Salerno became fortresses of suspicion. If you were a dock worker on the Neapolitan coast, every arriving ship might bring a new ruler. And no matter who sat on the throne, your life stayed the same, hungry, cold, and taxed into oblivion. Next, let's move to Burgundy. It's 1477. Charles the Bold is dead, and with him the last real hope of a united Burgundian kingdom. His dreams lie crushed in the snow outside Nancy, his body so mangled after the battle that it's only identified by his dental work. Charles had tried to make Burgundy a third great power rivaling France and the Holy Roman Empire. He built armies, took cities, and dreamed of a new Carolingian realm stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. But he overreached. His final campaign against the Swiss Confederacy was a disaster. He underestimated their tactics, their resolve, and most importantly, the terrain. The Battle of Nancy was supposed to be a show of strength. Instead, it was a grave. Charles's forces were annihilated. He died fighting proud to the last, but pride, as always, leaves wreckage behind. The aftermath was immediate and vicious. France moved in to claim Burgundian territories. The Habsburgs staked their claims through marriage. Burgundy became a battlefield for imperial ambition. And the people, they were swallowed up by borders that changed overnight. You might have been a weaver in Dijon suddenly asked to pay tax to a king you'd never seen before. Or a brewer in Ghent watching as soldiers you couldn't understand marched through your street and liberated your neighborhood. Charles the Bold wasn't evil, but he was blind to the limits of ambition. And when he fell, his entire dream collapsed. The great Duchy of Burgundy, so wealthy, so refined, simply ceased to exist. Now let's go even darker. To the north in Scandinavia, the Kalmar Union is fraying. It's the early 1500s and Sweden is growing restless. For over a century, the three kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, have been ruled by a single monarch. But unity is a delicate illusion. The real fracture comes under King Christian II of Denmark. He's crowned in 1513 and almost immediately begins making enemies. His rule in Sweden is heavy-handed, and when rebellion stirs, he crushes it violently. In 1520, he orchestrates the Stockholm bloodbath. Dozens of Swedish nobles, clergy, and scholars are executed over several days. The bodies are dumped in mass graves. The message, absolute control. But instead of cowing the Swedes, it ignites a full-scale war of independence. Gustav Vasa rises. Christian II is driven out. Sweden breaks from the Union permanently. Denmark descends into civil war. The Union dissolves. You might have been a young apprentice in Uppsala watching blood run through the cobbled streets and knowing that peace would not return in your lifetime. Christian II wanted to be remembered as a strong king. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a ruler so brutal that he tore apart the very union he claimed to preserve. Again and again, it's the same: a crown, a plan, and the blind spots of power. And every time it's not the kings who pay the most. It's the candle maker whose shop gets trampled, the goat herder whose son never returns from war, the midwife accused of spying because she once spoke to a soldier from the wrong side. You, in the midst of this history, would be just another body trying not to starve, not to burn, not to be seen. And now we cross into one of the most mysterious implosions of all, the Kingdom of Armenia. Let's keep going. You're in the highlands of Cilicia, a rocky kingdom nestled between the Crusader states and the rising Islamic empires. It's the early 14th century, and the Kingdom of Armenian Cilicia, once a proud Christian outpost, is dying. Not with the bang of a glorious battle, but with the slow, aching decay of betrayal, bad alliances, and kings who gambled away their people's future, like dice on a tavern table. The king is Leo IV, the last crowned ruler of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. He came to power in 1320, young and energetic, full of hopes, to revive the kingdom's faded strength. His people were surrounded Mamluks to the south, Turks to the north, and suspicious crusader remnants all around. But Leo's answer wasn't unity, it was desperation. Instead of shoring up his borders, he tried to westernize everything. He imposed Latin customs on an Armenian church that didn't want them. He pushed for papal recognition, aligning himself with Rome while alienating his own clergy. He thought he was modernizing. What he was really doing was hollowing out his kingdom's spiritual backbone. The people murmured, nobles plotted, and the Mamluks saw an opportunity. In 1375, after years of failed diplomacy and mounting internal fractures, the Mamluks invaded. Sis, the capital, fell. Leo was captured and taken to Cairo. The kingdom vanished, just like that. A 300-year legacy reduced to ashes. You might have been a scribe in Tarsus watching your manuscripts burn, or a mother in the hills hiding your children as the riders approached. The kingdom didn't fall because its enemies were stronger. It fell because its kings were weaker than their responsibilities. They chose pride over prudence, foreign recognition over local faith. Leo was eventually ransomed by European powers, given a pension, and lived out his days in exile in Paris. They say he died childless, with only memories of a kingdom that no longer existed. History barely mentions him now. But for the shepherds who once watched over the Cilician plains, his name might still echo in ruins and lullabies. Not as a hero, as a warning. Now we head west to Portugal. It's 1383 and something rare is happening. A kingdom without a king. King Ferdinand Vespers has died. He left no male heir. His only daughter Beatrice is married to the King of Castile, Spain's growing neighbor and Portugal's eternal rival. The Portuguese nobles panic. If Beatrice becomes queen, Castile may absorb Portugal altogether. Enter the 1383-1385 crisis. 2 years of civil war coups and suspicion. The master of Aviz, an illegitimate son of a former king, rises as a candidate. Castile invades. Lisbon is besieged. Famine strikes. You, perhaps a fisherman on the Tagus River, watch ships burn and nets go empty. You hear rumors of betrayals, shifting alliances, and battles in the countryside. But your world is shrinking, your focus narrowing to tonight's firewood and tomorrow's bread. Eventually, the master of Aviz triumphs. He becomes King John I and founds the Aviz dynasty. Portugal wins independence. The future looks golden exploration trade empire. But none of that feels real to the people who lived through the panic. Because when the crown wobbles, everyone's head rolls. Let's go north now, Norway. The year is 1319. You're in the harbor town of Bergen, smelling fish tar and uncertainty. The last male heir of Norway's royal line has died. A child is crowned Magnus VII, who also becomes King of Sweden. He is 3 years old. For the next few decades, Scandinavia stumbles through regencies, alliances, and noble factions. Magnus eventually rules both realms, but he is indecisive, too trusting of favorites, and blind to political maneuvering. Under his reign, Norway begins its long decline from sovereign kingdom to semi-autonomous province. The Black Death arrives in 1349 and devastates the population. Norway is never the same. Farms are abandoned. Churches rot. The nobility weakens, and with it so does the monarchy. If you lived through that era, you'd watch your neighbors vanish in a season. You'd hear sermons about God's wrath. You'd bury your parents and pray not to bury your children. and somewhere in the stillness, you might wonder why no king came to help. Because by the time help was possible, the crown was too distant, too scattered, too lost in treaties and debts to see you. Now cross the sea to Ireland again. The year is 1315. Yes, we were here before, but the full story of Edward Bruce's invasion and the Irish kings who invited him is worth telling again. The Gaelic lords, sick of English domination, invited Edward Bruce to lead a rebellion. They hoped a Scottish alliance would free them. But what came instead was plague, famine, and destruction. Bruce fought, but he couldn't feed his men. He was crowned High King, but most Irish clans didn't recognize him. And when he was killed in 1318, his army dissolved. The English tightened their grip. The Gaelic kingdoms suffered reprisals. The brief spark of independence faded, replaced by bitter silence. You, an old bard in Ulster, might have sung his coronation with trembling hope, and by the time your song reached its end, realized you were writing an elegy for a future that never arrived. The tragedy of these kings wasn't that they failed to act. It was that they acted too quickly or too blindly. They mistook ambition for leadership, and those beneath them bore the cost. Now let's sail to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Cyprus. It's the 15th century. The Lusignan kings of Cyprus, originally from France, are trying to rule an island caught between East and West. Venice and Genoa vie for ports. The Mamluks want tribute. Pirates raid at will. The nobles are at each other's throats. King James II, nicknamed the Bastard, claims the throne in 1460 through cunning and blood. He imprisons his rivals, marries a Venetian, and invites foreign influence deeper into Cypriot life. The island becomes wealthy but fragile. When James dies, suddenly, his widow, Queen Catherine Cornaro, becomes regent. But Venice soon pressures her into handing over the island. In 1489, Cyprus becomes a Venetian colony. Another crown gone. Another kingdom erased by slow diplomacy, fast betrayal, and the illusion of control. You might have been a lemon merchant in Nicosia watching the Venetian flags unfurl, wondering what happened to the king whose name you just learned to pronounce. So many of these disasters don't begin with swords. They begin with ink, treaties, marriages, promises. But they end the same way, with smoke on the horizon, hunger in your stomach, and a question in your heart. Did the king ever think of me at all? Let's keep going. You're walking the dusty path into Granada, Spain. It's the final years of the 15th century, and the city, once the glittering jewel of Al-Andalus, is wilting beneath the weight of a siege. The last Muslim kingdom in Iberia is under pressure. The Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain, is almost complete. But inside these walls, one king clings to power with desperation rather than vision. His name is Muhammad XII, but history remembers him as Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler of Granada. You watch as his decisions, marked by hesitation and half-hearted resistance, unravel what's left of an empire centuries in the making. Boabdil came to the throne through civil war, ousting his father and battling his uncle for control. While Christian forces led by Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon tightened the noose Boabdil wasted years fighting his own family. Even when captured and released by the Christians, in exchange for concessions, he continued to believe he could outplay them. But the crown he wore was already too heavy with debts and divided loyalties. By 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella had encircled Granada. The city, once rich with poetry and fountains now reeked of fear and famine. And in January 1492, Boabdil surrendered, not with defiance, not with fire, but with a quiet, resigned signature on a treaty. The handover was solemn. The Christians promised tolerance for a time. But as you pass through the Alhambra's gardens, still echoing with the footsteps of poets and scholars, you feel the shift. Mosques will soon become churches. Arabic will fade from the streets. The treaty will be broken. Forced conversions, expulsions, and inquisitions will follow. And Boabdil. He weeps as he leaves, literally. His mother scolds him, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." He vanishes into North Africa, remembered not for resistance, but for retreat. You might have been a weaver in the Albaicin quarter, seeing crosses rise where crescents once stood, or a scholar hiding your manuscripts before the inquisitors arrived. The fall of Granada wasn't just the end of a kingdom, it was the erasure of a world. And one man's indecision was the thread that unraveled it all. Now we turn east again to the Balkans. It's the 14th century, and the Kingdom of Serbia is rising fast under Tsar Stefan Dušan. Tall, charismatic, and ambitious Dušan expands the Serbian Empire to its greatest extent, dreaming of a Christian realm to rival Byzantium, and he nearly makes it. But then, as you might expect by now, he dies suddenly in 1355, some say, poisoned, some say by stroke. And everything he built begins to decay, not from outside pressure, but from within. His son Uroš V inherits the crown, but not the strength. They call him Uroš the Weak. He couldn't command the fractious nobles or manage the newly conquered lands. He didn't control the army. He didn't control the court. Instead of a single empire, Serbia splintered into a patchwork of competing princes and warlords, each more interested in personal gain than national stability. And in 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, that weakness came due. The Ottomans advanced. The Serbian forces, led by Prince Lazar, stood against them. It was a battle drenched in myth and blood. Both leaders died. The Serbs claimed valor, but the Ottomans kept coming. Serbia would be vassalized, then absorbed. And Uroš the Weak, who'd already died years earlier, was buried not just in body, but in memory, as the king who couldn't hold it together. If you were a blacksmith in Niš or a farmer near the Morava River, you might not know politics, but you'd see the signs. Nobles squabbling while taxes rose. Roads growing less safe. The church preaching doom. And always that sinking feeling that no one at the top knew what they were doing. Let's head north now to Poland again. The year is 1700, technically a bit past the medieval period, but the legacy of medieval misrule is still very much alive. This is the era of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the throne belongs to Augustus II, the Strong. He's king of Poland and elector of Saxony, and he lives up to his nickname. He's physically strong, yes, but also obsessed with image. He hosts lavish balls, throws money at projects, and dreams of turning the Commonwealth into an absolute monarchy like France. The problem, Poland's political system, is a nightmare. The nobles, Szlachta, hold massive power through something called the liberum veto, which allows any single noble to block legislation. One man can stop an entire parliamentary session, and they often do. Augustus tries to centralize power anyway. He starts a war with Sweden, the Great Northern War, thinking he can win glory. Instead, he loses his crown temporarily brings devastation to the countryside and spends years trying to claw back what he threw away in months. The Commonwealth weakens, foreign influence grows, Russia begins to meddle, and the seeds of Poland's future partitions are sown not by enemies, but by leaders like Augustus, who overreached and underperformed. If you lived in Warsaw or Lublin at the time, you'd hear the laughter from royal parties echoing down muddy streets where food prices soared. You'd see nobles duel over vanity while foreign soldiers patrolled your market. And you'd wonder, how did we let this happen? Let's turn to Bohemia now. Modern-day Czechia. The early 1400s. King Wenceslaus IV is on the throne. Son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, Wenceslaus was supposed to be a worthy successor. He had the name, the court, the bloodline, but he didn't have the spine. Wenceslaus drank. He avoided responsibility. He neglected the imperial throne and lost the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Religious tensions boiled beneath the surface. Jan Hus and his followers were calling for reform in the church, preaching, in Czech, challenging Latin authority. Wenceslaus wavered. First, he tolerated the movement. Then he cracked down. Then he panicked. Hus was eventually burned at the stake, and Bohemia exploded in the Hussite Wars. Civil war. Religious conflict. Neighboring kingdoms intervened. Cities were torched. Monasteries looted. You might have been a brewer in Kutna Hora, your silver mine shut down by religious zealots. Or a nun in Prague dragged from your convent for harboring the wrong books. And all because a king couldn't decide which side to choose until it was too late. And finally, tonight, let's peer into Scotland once more. It's the 1430s. James I has returned from captivity in England after 18 years away. He's furious, determined to reform, and paranoid. He launches aggressive reforms, centralizes authority, cuts down rebellious nobles. On paper, he's doing what Scotland needed, but his methods are brutal. He ignores local power structures. He executes without trial. He makes enemies. In 1437, he is assassinated, stabbed to death in a sewer tunnel by nobles who'd had enough. And you may be a servant in Perth, whispering prayers as you scrub the blood from the stone floor before sunrise. Another king, another reformer, another death. And always the lesson remains, crowns shine bright, but they cast long shadows. Let's keep going. You're standing now in the sun-baked ruins of Antioch, long after the Crusader banners have rotted from its towers. It's the early 13th century, and the Latin East, those Crusader kingdoms carved from the Levant, is crumbling. One by one, castles are falling. Alliances are shattering. Kings and princes argue while the walls crack beneath them. The kingdom of Jerusalem is a ghost. The principality of Antioch hanging by a thread. And at the center of this slow-motion collapse is a man named Bohemond IV of Antioch, also known as Bohemond the One-Eyed. His reign from 1201 to 1233 wasn't marked by great battles or stunning victories. It was marked by petty feuds, civil war, paranoia, and mismanagement that practically handed the region back to its enemies. Bohemond had one job: hold the line against Muslim powers, particularly the increasingly powerful Ayyubids in Egypt and Syria. But instead of uniting the Crusader lords, he fought his own vassals. He refused to recognize the authority of the Latin Patriarch in Antioch. He expelled allies. He alienated Armenian support, one of the region's few remaining friendly powers. While Bohemond argued with bishops and squabbled over taxes, the Muslim world united. Fortresses that had once withstood siege after siege were abandoned or taken without a fight. Antioch was no longer a symbol of Christian resilience. It was a withering husk. If you were a tanner's apprentice in Tripoli, or a monk in a lonely Maronite village, you would have watched hope unravel. The kings had come with swords and fire, but they left with squabbles and sand in their mouths. And the world moved on without them. From here we sail across the Mediterranean to North Africa, to Egypt, to Cairo. The Mamluks rule now a military caste of enslaved warriors who rose to power through sheer force and cunning. But power always draws enemies. And in 1382, a new sultan takes the throne, Barkuk. Barkuk wasn't born noble. He was a Circassian slave trained for war, promoted for loyalty. When he seized power, he claimed legitimacy through strength. But his rise shattered the already fragile trust within the ruling elite. The Mamluks, who prided themselves on hierarchy and seniority, saw him as an upstart. Rebellions followed. His reign was a cycle of coup and counter-coup. He was overthrown, once returned by force, and spent years purging rivals. Egypt. Usually the breadbasket of the region suffered. Nile floods failed. Prices rose. Infighting among Mamluk factions turned Cairo's streets into arenas. If you lived in the city, then you'd see soldiers beating down doors one week, then retreating the next. You'd feel power shifting daily, one emir in the morning, another by supper. Justice became a luxury. Predictability. A myth. Barkuk eventually stabilized the Sultanate, but the scars of his rise lingered. The Mamluk system would continue its violent power rotations for another century until the Ottomans absorbed them altogether. No king, not even a slave-born one, could escape the gravity of chaos once it had been unleashed. Now drift westward to France again. It's 1420 and something unthinkable has happened. The King of France, Charles VI, has signed the Treaty of Troyes. He has disinherited his own son, the future Charles VII, and declared that Henry V of England, the man waging war against him, will inherit the throne of France. Madness, not quite, but close. Charles VI suffered from severe mental illness, sometimes believing he was made of glass, or forgetting he was king altogether. During his lucid periods, he was isolated, controlled, manipulated by his wife Isabeau of Bavaria and scheming nobles who favored an English alliance. Henry V, bold and calculating, seized the opportunity. He married Charles's daughter Catherine. He was poised to become king of both England and France, a union that terrified both kingdoms in equal measure. But then fate intervened. Henry died in 1422, and just weeks later, so did Charles VI. The crown passed not to a man, but to a baby. Henry VI of England, an infant who would become King of France by treaty, but never by fact. France erupted. The Dauphin Charles VII refused to be erased. Civil war intensified. The 100 Years' War dragged on. And the people, they lived under a sky of falling ash. You, a cobbler in Orleans, might have been forced to swear loyalty to 3 different kings in 1 year. And still your boots went unsoled and your bread unrisen. Because while kings plotted inheritances, the towns burned. And then came the strangest twist of all, a teenage girl from Domremy, claiming divine visions, would pick up the banner Charles VII dropped and led France back from the brink. But that's for another time. Let's turn now to the Kingdom of Hungary again, this time to the reign of Louis II. It's the early 16th century. The Ottomans are expanding again, and Hungary stands as the bulwark between Europe and empire. But Louis is only a boy when he becomes king. He is rushed into power, surrounded by advisors, ill-prepared for what's coming. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent invades. The Hungarian army, disorganized and poorly led, is annihilated. Louis himself dies in retreat, thrown from his horse into a river and drowned. With one battle, medieval Hungary collapses. The Ottomans take Buda. The Habsburgs claim the rest. For the next 150 years, Hungary is a battleground, divided, ruled by foreign powers, and subject to endless war. You might be a farmer in Pécs, forced to tithe to two different kings, or a priest in Szeged watching your flock vanish, conscripted or scattered. And you'd know this Hungary didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because its king was too young, too rushed, too alone. Now drift into the Alps. Switzerland, before it was neutral, before the clocks and chocolate. In the 15th century, the Swiss Confederacy was rising. Peasants and townsfolk banded together against noble overlords. They fought the Habsburgs and won. But even here, misrule was waiting. In 1499, the Swabian War erupts between the Swiss and the Holy Roman Empire. The Emperor Maximilian I wanted to centralize power, impose taxes, bring the Swiss to heel. But he didn't understand the culture of independence that had rooted itself in the Alpine valleys. He sent armies, demanded fealty, and he failed. His ambitions were too big for his reach. His soldiers underestimated the terrain. The Swiss defeated imperial forces at multiple points, guerrilla warfare in snow-covered passes, ambushes in narrow valleys. The result: the empire had to recognize Swiss autonomy. But the war had burned villages, emptied granaries, and orphaned hundreds. You, a shepherd in Uri, might have watched imperial banners flutter on the horizon, knowing your goats weren't just livestock. They were your life, your resistance, your rebellion. One more stop tonight. Let's go to Naples again, because Naples never quite gets it right. It's 1494. Charles VIII of France invades Italy, claiming the Neapolitan crown. The King of Naples, Alfonso II, panics. He abdicates almost immediately, just walks away. His son Ferentino is left to deal with the fallout. But morale collapses. The French army marches in. The Kingdom of Naples surrenders almost without a fight. You might be a baker in Salerno watching foreign troops dance in your plaza, wondering why your king left you to face them alone. Because sometimes the disaster isn't war or plague. Sometimes it's simply this, a king who runs when he should have stayed. Let's keep going. You're ankle deep in mud now, the air wet with sea spray and the distant sound of gulls. The year is 1216, and you're on the southern coast of England, watching ships from France land with barely a sword drawn to stop them. A crown lies in the balance. A child king waits to be crowned. And the man who lost everything, King John. Yes, that King John, of Robin Hood infamy, of Magna Carta fame. But those myths don't quite capture the depth of the catastrophe he left behind. By 1215, John had managed to alienate just about everyone, barons, the church, his own mercenaries. His campaigns in France were disastrous, losing Normandy, Anjou, and nearly every piece of land his father and brother had fought for. He taxed his subjects into revolt. He quarreled with the Pope and was excommunicated. He failed to feed his own garrisons. And then, when the barons rebelled and invited Prince Louis of France to invade, John fled rather than fight. The Magna Carta, often celebrated today as a milestone in democracy, was in its time a desperate ceasefire, a bandage over a hemorrhage. John signed it, then broke it almost immediately. Civil war followed. While Louis advanced from the south, John died of dysentery on the road, supposedly from eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider in Newark. You, a fisherman near Dover, or a tanner in Winchester, might have watched a French banner rise over your town and wondered, are we French now? Is England still a kingdom or just a battlefield? John's infant son, Henry III, was crowned in a rush. But for a moment, England was barely a country. It was a failed state, because of one man's arrogance, incompetence, and refusal to listen. From here, we walk the stone paths of Aragon. The sun is hot. The year is 1410. King Martin of Aragon is dead, and there's no heir. He had one technically, but the prince died young after eating too much at a wedding banquet and falling ill. So now the crown of Aragon, a powerful Mediterranean state with holdings in Sicily, Sardinia, and even parts of Greece, is leaderless. The nobles panic. Civil war threatens. The Compromise of Caspe is held in 1412, where several candidates are considered. Ultimately, they choose Ferdinand of Castile. And just like that, the House of Trastamara rules both Castile and Aragon. Sounds peaceful, it isn't. Ferdinand brings Castilian politics and Castilian advisors into Aragonese lands. The local nobility, fiercely proud, resist. Tensions rise. The seeds of a future Spanish unification are planted, but so too is a deep resentment that will simmer for generations. Catalonia, in particular, begins to sense the long, slow strangling of its autonomy. You might be a baker in Valencia or a sailor in Mallorca, feeling laws change, taxes rise, and wondering when your homeland became a province instead of a kingdom. Because sometimes kingdoms end not with war, but with a signature. Now to Central Europe, the Kingdom of Bavaria, the Wittelsbach dynasty. The year is 1347, and Emperor Louis IV has just died. His sons split the inheritance like a birthday cake, Bavaria carved into shards. What follows is decades of infighting. Louis's descendants feud over titles, land succession. One duke wages war on another. Peasant villages are torched not by enemies, but by rival claimants to the same throne. Bavaria becomes a patchwork of angry little courts. And then comes the plague. In 1349, the Black Death reaches southern Germany. Entire towns vanish. Monasteries are gutted. Fields go untilled. 1/3 of the population gone. But do the dukes stop fighting? Of course not. They squabble even as the bells toll daily for the dead. You might be a brewer in Regensburg or a cobbler in Passau, wondering why, when death walks the streets, the lords still argue about who owns which hill. Because for kings and dukes, power was more real than plague. Let's move east to the Kingdom of Georgia. Yes, that Georgia. Not in the US, but the one tucked between the Black Sea and the Caspian, where mountains meet empire. In the 12th century, Georgia was a beacon of culture, power, and stability, especially under Queen Tamar, one of the most successful rulers of the medieval era. But by the 13th century, things had changed. The Mongols came, then the Black Death, then the Timurids, and by the 15th century, Georgia had splintered into rival kingdoms and principalities. One king after another tried to reunify the land. One after another failed. Alexander I, who ruled in the early 1400s, made one of the last real attempts. He was pious, determined, and deeply respected. But he abdicated in 1442, handing power to his sons and retiring to a monastery. A noble gesture, maybe, but it unleashed chaos. The sons fought, nobles rebelled, kingdoms fractured again. And what was once a single crown became three. Georgia would not recover until the 19th century. You might have been a stonemason in Kutaisi, watching fortresses crumble as cousins marched against each other, or a monk in Mitsketa, copying psalms while the world around you unraveled. And you'd wonder why give up when the kingdom was barely holding. Now we go south again, to Italy, to the Kingdom of Sicily, or should we say the two Sicilies. By the late Middle Ages, the island of Sicily and the mainland territories of Naples had diverged so much that they were ruled by different branches of the same royal family, both calling themselves King of Sicily. Confusing, absolutely. Dangerous, even more. In 1282, the Sicilian Vespers rebellion had split the kingdom in two. Ever since rival kings fought over the name, the land, and the legacy. By the 15th century, Sicily is ruled by the Crown of Aragon. Naples, meanwhile, sees an endless parade of claimants, French, Spanish, and local. The people on both sides are caught in the crossfire. One particularly grim example, King Ladislaus of Naples, ruling in the early 1400s. He wanted to reunite the two kingdoms, and to do it, he marched armies through the papal states, sacking towns, threatening Rome, and turning Italy's heartland into a war zone. He never succeeded. He died young, and the project collapsed, but the scars remained. You might be a herdsman in Calabria, or a merchant in Palermo, unsure which monarch to answer to praying. Your port wasn't blockaded this season. Because when kings fight over names, it's the nameless who bleed. And what of Burgundy? Yes, we touched on it, but the story goes deeper. After the death of Charles the Bold in 1477, the duchy splintered. The French king Louis XI seized Burgundy proper, but Charles's daughter Mary of Burgundy inherited the rest and married Maximilian of Habsburg. This union would birth centuries of war, because now the Habsburgs had a foothold in France's backyard. Every future war, Italian wars, the 30 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, would have its seeds in that single moment. Mary died young, falling from a horse. Her son Philip the Handsome inherited. But by then, Burgundy as a kingdom was gone, replaced by dynastic conflict. You might be a silversmith in Bruges, watching banners change and coins devalue. The dukes were dead, but the wars had just begun. And finally, we return to Constantinople. Not 1453 yet, but close. The last emperors of Byzantium knew what was coming. The Ottoman threat was real. The empire had shrunk to a few coastal cities and the capital. But Emperor John VIII, Palaiologos, believed unity with the West could save them. So he journeyed to Italy, attended the Council of Florence, agreed to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for military aid. The people of Constantinople were horrified. They viewed the union as betrayal. The Western aid barely arrived. The empire was now divided internally, church against church, citizen against citizen. John returned with nothing but anger. He died in 1448. His brother Constantine XI would face the final siege alone. But it was John's compromise, seen as weakness, that fractured the last unity Byzantium had. You might have been a baker in the Fanar district, trying to feed your family, while priests fought in the streets over the shape of the cross. Because by then, the end was a whisper no one dared to say aloud. And you'd have heard it. You'd have felt it. The quiet before the gates fell. Let's keep going. You're in the narrow alleys of Constantinople now. The year is 1453. Dawn. A trembling quiet clings to the stones. Somewhere beyond the Theodosian walls, drums begin to beat a slow, steady rhythm that matches your pulse. Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottomans is out there with over 80,000 troops. Inside the city, barely 7,000 defenders remain. And the Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, stands on the edge of legend and oblivion. This is the end of Byzantium. The empire that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean for over 1,000 years now barely controls its capital and a handful of outposts. The rest is gone, swallowed by the Turks, the Latins, and time itself. But on this final day, the emperor refuses to flee. Constantine XI, though brave and deeply pious, inherited an empire already dead on paper. His predecessor, John VIII, had tried to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches to summon Western aid. But that alliance fractured the city's unity. Most citizens rejected the union. The Pope sent only token help. Venice and Genoa bickered. And as Mehmed's army encircled the city, Constantine had no real support beyond prayers and a few mercenaries. The night before the fall, he led a final service in Hagia Sophia. Greeks and Latins stood together in dim candlelight weeping, not from hope but from the crushing weight of ending. And then came the breach. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans stormed the city. The gates fell. Constantine disappeared in the final melee. Legend says he tore off his imperial regalia and died fighting as a common soldier. But in truth, no one really knows. His body was never found. And you might have been a baker's son in Galata watching fires climb into the sky. Or a monk in the Blackerney Monastery clutching a relic as the walls shook. Or a grandmother whispering the Jesus prayer while footsteps thundered down the marble streets. For the people of Constantinople, the end wasn't just military, it was spiritual, cultural, civilizational. And for the kings who'd ruled it in its final century, their failure was simple. They clung to ritual while ignoring reality. They negotiated, debated, signed unions, but never united their people. And when the walls cracked, everything fell at once. Now we move west again, to England. The Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest dynastic conflicts in medieval Europe. It's the late 15th century, and the crown passes like a cursed heirloom between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Kings rise and fall so fast that if you're a blacksmith in York or a wool merchant in Coventry, you probably stop trying to learn their names. At the center of the chaos, Henry VI, a deeply religious, gentle man, utterly unfit for the brutal politics of his age. Crowned as a child, Henry was more monk than monarch. He preferred prayer to politics. But the court was full of wolves. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou brought a powerful queen to his side, but also deepened factional divides. When Henry suffered a mental breakdown in 1453, the kingdom erupted. The Duke of York claimed regency. Battles broke out. Executions followed. Henry was deposed, then restored, then deposed again. Finally, in 1471, after the Battle of Tewkesbury, Henry's son was killed, and Henry himself was murdered, likely on orders from the newly crowned Edward IV. England had a king who couldn't rule, and the realm paid for it in blood. You, a tenant farmer in the Midlands, might have had your crops trampled by armies from both sides. First white roses, then red. The only thing that stayed the same was the hunger, but the worst was yet to come. Let's look at Edward IV's successor, his young son, Edward V, one of the princes in the Tower. Edward V was never crowned. After Edward IV's death in 1483, the boy and his younger brother were taken to the Tower of London, supposedly for protection. But soon they vanished. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, claimed the throne. He said the boys were illegitimate. Many believed he had them killed. Richard III became king, but his crown was haunted. By 1485, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant, landed in Wales. At the Battle of Bosworth, Richard was killed. His last words, allegedly, "Treason, treason." His body was buried in a monastery and later lost, only rediscovered in a parking lot centuries later. Richard III's mistake wasn't just murder. It was believing that fear could bring stability. It never does. You might have been a fishmonger in London too afraid to speak the names of the missing princes aloud, or a school teacher in Leicester teaching your students to smile at whoever held the crown that week. Because to survive the Wars of the Roses, neutrality was the only shield. Let's turn now to Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. 1,000 states, semi-autonomous, loosely held together under a single emperor. The dream of Charlemagne had turned into a bureaucratic jungle. By the 15th century, the emperor is Frederick III, a man so cautious. He was called Arch-Sleepyhead of the Holy Roman Empire. He avoided war, avoided reform, avoided nearly everything. And while peace has its virtues, his reign is best remembered for its inertia. The empire under his watch became riddled with corruption. Banditry flourished. Local nobles waged private wars. Towns built their own militias. The imperial court moved at the speed of molasses. Frederick's motto, A-E-I-O-U, was never fully explained. Some say it meant Austria est imperare orbi universo. Austria is destined to rule the world. Others think it was just nonsense. Either way, his failure to reform left the empire brittle. When his son Maximilian I took over, he spent most of his reign trying to untangle the knots Frederick left behind. If you were a merchant in Ulm or a priest in Salzburg, your daily life would be ruled not by the emperor, but by your local bishop or a robber baron or a town council armed to the teeth. Because when kings sleep, others wake up hungry. Now to the north again. Norway. By the late 15th century, Norway was a shadow. Once a proud seafaring kingdom, it had become the forgotten partner in the Kalmar Union, ruled in name by Denmark, but neglected in practice. The Norwegian nobility weakened. The economy withered. Bergen, once a great Hanseatic port, was choked by foreign merchants and local decay. No Norwegian king ruled from Norway. No army protected its shores. You might have been a fisherman in Lofoten watching Danish tax ships arrive and wondering whether your kingdom even existed anymore. Norway hadn't been defeated. It had been abandoned. Let's turn briefly to the eastern edge of Europe, to Moldavia. It's the late 1400s, and Prince Stephen the Great has spent decades holding the Ottomans at bay. He's one of the last true defenders of Christian Eastern Europe. But after his death, his successors squander his legacy. Internal corruption, power struggles, unpaid armies, and eventually Ottoman domination. You might be a woodcutter in Suceava hearing Turkish drums on the wind and knowing no help is coming. Because one good king is never enough. It takes generations to build, one generation to ruin. One more stop before we rest tonight. We return to France. King Charles VIII, crowned in 1483, young, idealistic, and reckless. In 1494, he invades Italy, claiming the throne of Naples through a convoluted dynastic claim. It sparks the Italian Wars, decades of bloody conflict between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire over Italian territory. Charles takes Naples quickly, then loses it even faster. Disease, rebellion, and foreign coalitions drive him out. France is weakened. Italy is devastated. The Renaissance is interrupted by fire and steel. Charles dies in 1498 after hitting his head on a doorframe. Literally. You might be a Florentine apprentice watching French knights loot art and gold, or a soldier from Savoy dying in a swamp over lamb your king has never seen. Because the greatest disasters don't always wear horns. Sometimes they wear crowns. Let's keep going. You're in a Florentine workshop now, the scent of linseed oil and wet plaster clinging to the walls. It's the early 1500s, and while you shape a statue's arm or prepare pigments for a master's brush outside the city, armies are marching again. Because Italy in all its beauty has become the chessboard of Europe. And the kings moving the pieces, some of the most spectacularly misguided rulers history ever produced. Let's begin with Ludovico Sforza il Moro, Duke of Milan, a patron of Leonardo da Vinci, a man of wealth, taste, and catastrophic decision-making. In the late 1490s, Ludovico fears the growing power of Naples. So what does he do? He invites Charles VIII of France to intervene. Charles accepts charges across the Alps and starts the Italian Wars. Ludovico realizes too late that inviting a foreign king into Italy was like opening your door to a wolf because you heard a rumor about a fox. Charles eventually retreats, but the floodgates are open. Now Spain, France, the papacy, and the Holy Roman Empire all want a slice of Italy. Ludovico ends up captured by the French, spends the rest of his life in a cage, and Milan becomes a battleground. You might be a stonemason in Pavia watching soldiers repaint your city's coat of arms every other season. Or a spice merchant in Parma with your shelves bare because no trade route is safe. All because a duke thought alliances were toys and kings his playthings. Next, we slide west to France. The year is 1547. Francis I is dead. His son Henry VI inherits a kingdom still scarred by the Italian Wars, but Henry wants glory and vengeance, especially against the Habsburgs. At first he seems promising. He reforms the army, asserts royal power. But his obsession with war and the persecution of Protestants sets fires he can't contain. His reign sparks a wave of repression against French Huguenots Protestants who are growing in number and influence. And then, in a bizarre twist of fate, Henry dies during a joust. A splintered lance pierces his eye. His son Francis II takes the throne at just 15 and dies a year later. Next comes Charles IX, then Henry III. Three brothers, one throne, and a country spiraling into chaos. By the 1560s, France is in full religious civil war. Catholics versus Huguenots. Cities are divided. Massacres erupt. In 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre sees thousands of Protestants butchered in Paris, many in their beds. The royal court ordered it. Some say the king himself gave the nod. You might be a candle maker in Lyon, burying your Protestant neighbor at night. Or a Catholic shoemaker in Rouen, terrified your church will be burned next. The kings of France, obsessed with inheritance and image, failed to grasp the fury rising below them. They thought royal marriage could solve division. Instead, it lit a match. Now let's cross to Spain. The late 1500s. King Philip II rules a global empire. He has gold from the Americas, an armada to threaten England. A divine mission, or so he believes, to eradicate Protestantism from Europe. But Philip is cautious to the point of paralysis. He demands total control, micromanages from his desk, and delays critical decisions. His empire becomes a bloated machine that moves too slowly to survive. In 1588, he launches the Spanish Armada against England. Over 130 ships, thousands of men. The plan is bold: invade, overthrow. Queen Elizabeth I restore Catholic rule. But storms, miscommunication, and English resistance turn the fleet into a floating disaster. Most of the ships don't make it home. Spain, once feared, begins its long, slow decline. You, a farmer in Valencia, might hear rumors of ships sunk off Ireland. And while the crown spins it as divine will, you just know taxes will rise again because someone has to pay for those lost cannons and sails. Philip's successors, weak and isolated, inherit a kingdom exhausted by ambition. The 30 Years' War looms. Now we move north. Scotland, again. It's the 1540s. King James V is dead. His only surviving legitimate heir, Mary, Queen of Scots, a baby, crowned at 9 months old. Scotland is divided. England under Henry VIII wants Mary to marry his son Edward and unite the kingdoms. Scotland refuses. So Henry launches the rough wooing, a brutal campaign to force the issue. You read that right war by marriage proposal. Cities burn. Monasteries are sacked. And little Mary is eventually sent to France, where she marries the French Dauphin. For a time, she becomes queen of 2 kingdoms. But then the wheel turns. Her husband dies. She returns to Scotland and walks straight into a storm of suspicion, religious tension, and political sabotage. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, is murdered. Her third, Bothwell, is accused. She marries him anyway. The nobles rebel. She's imprisoned, forced to abdicate. Her infant son, James, becomes king. Mary flees to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead, she is held under house arrest for nearly 20 years, then executed for treason. You might be a guard at Fotheringhay Castle, hearing the thud of the axe, and wondering if this is how queens always die now. Not in battle, but in rooms lined with tapestries with silence afterward. Mary's misrule wasn't simply personal. It was a storm of poor judgment, bad alliances, and political naivete. Her tragedy became Scotland's, and her fall set the stage for centuries of British drama. And what of Russia? In 1584, Ivan the Terrible dies. His son Fyodor I takes the throne, a gentle, pious man, but not a ruler. The real power falls to Boris Godunov, Fyodor's brother-in-law. When Fyodor dies childless in 1598, Boris is elected Tsar. But his reign is marked by famine, unrest, and paranoia. The nobles hate him. The peasants don't trust him. And when a pretender false Dmitri claims to be Ivan's dead son, the people rally to him. Russia descends into chaos. The time of troubles, famine, civil war, foreign invasion. You, a peasant in Smolensk, might plant barley one year only to have it stolen by Polish troops the next. One winter there is no firewood. By spring there is no village. The Romanovs would eventually restore order. But Boris's failure opened the gates to a decade of agony. Now let's return to the German states. The Protestant Reformation has begun. Martin Luther nailed his theses in 1517. By the 1530s, Europe is ablaze with reform. But Emperor Charles V, ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, fails to grasp the depth of the movement. He tries to crush Protestantism with military force, launching the Schmalkaldic War against Protestant princes. He wins some battles, but the movement doesn't die. And in 1555, he's forced to sign the Peace of Augsburg, acknowledging that rulers may choose their state's religion. Too little, too late. You might be a bookseller in Wittenberg watching as Catholic soldiers torch Protestant texts one year, then flee the next. And always the fear who rules us now, who owns our souls, because when kings don't understand what's changing beneath them, they mistake evolution for rebellion. And then they lose everything. Let's finish this section in Naples again. Because Naples never learns. It's 1647. The Spanish Habsburgs rule Naples. Taxes are high. The people are starving. A fishmonger named Masaniello leads a revolt. He rallies the poor. They seize the city. For 10 days, Naples is free. Then Masaniello is assassinated. The rebellion collapses. The Spanish return. And Naples sinks back into silence. You might be a grandmother in a tenement near the harbor, still telling your grandson that for 1 week, just one, you saw a kingdom run by a commoner. It didn't last. But it lit a memory that sometimes when kings ruin everything, someone else dares to lift the pieces. Let's keep going. You're in a dimly lit tavern in Vienna now, the year 1618. The fire crackles low. The room is hushed, waiting. Something heavy is in the air, not smoke, but tension. Outside the walls of the city, storm clouds are forming. Not of weather, but of war. And the men about to start it, kings, emperors, and electors who still believed they could force faith down a people's throat, and that no one would choke on it. This is the dawn of the 30 Years' War. At the center of the conflict is Ferdinand II, newly crowned King of Bohemia and soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, a devout Catholic with a Jesuit education and a zealot's heart. Ferdinand wants to roll back the Reformation, wipe out Protestantism in his realm, and restore the Catholic order. Bohemia, however, is largely Protestant. Its nobles had enjoyed decades of religious tolerance, autonomy, and freedom of worship. But now, with Ferdinand in power, that tolerance is ending. So what do? They throw his representatives out the window. Literally. The Second Defenestration of Prague sees two Catholic governors tossed from the castle window by angry Protestant nobles. Somehow they survive landing in a pile of manure, depending on who tells the story. But the symbolic message is clear: Bohemia will not submit. Ferdinand responds with fire and sword. What follows is not a war, it's a cataclysm. For 30 years, Europe is torn apart. Mercenary armies rampage across the continent, pillaging, raping, starving entire regions. The war expands beyond Bohemia, engulfing Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, France, Denmark, Poland, even the Ottoman Empire. It becomes less about religion and more about power. But the people suffering on the ground, they don't care about theology or geopolitics. They care about bread, safety, survival. You might be a miller's wife near Magdeburg in 1631, watching your entire town go up in flames, over 20,000 people slaughtered in one of the war's worst atrocities. Or a child in the Rhineland eating bark and leather saw while warlords argue over your village's allegiance. By the end of it all, the population of Germany is reduced by a third. Some towns vanish forever. The Peace of Westphalia is signed in 1648, too late to save the dead. And Ferdinand, he dies mid-war, his name remembered not for reform or unity, but for unleashing the apocalypse. Now shift south to the Iberian Peninsula. The once golden empire of Spain is cracking. It's the reign of Philip IV. He inherits a kingdom exhausted by war, overextended by empire, and bleeding from its treasury. But instead of reforming, Philip doubles down. He supports Ferdinand's war. He clings to the dying Spanish Netherlands. He listens to his trusted advisor, the Count Duke of Olivares, who promises victory through centralization and austerity. What Spain gets instead is rebellion. Portugal breaks away in 1640. Catalonia revolts. Naples erupts. Spanish armies are stretched thin. By 1643, at the Battle of Rocroi, French forces crush Spain's elite infantry, the feared tercios. It's a moment historians will later mark as the end of Spanish military dominance. You might be a baker in Barcelona watching Castilian troops loot your quarter during peacetime. Or a student in Salamanca reading war reports while your stomach growls from famine. Spain, once the richest empire in the world, is rotting from within. And Philip IV, poetic melancholy, aloof, never sees the truth.